What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 758. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, what's going on, man? How goes?
Not a whole lot. Getting back into Cube team drafting. The kind of draft server took a bit of a hiatus between MH3 and the Pro Tour, and now we're kind of back in full swing, and it's been fun because I just did a pretty big Cube update myself, so been enjoying that.
Oh, that's cool. And so we'll be seeing those reflected on your YouTube channel soon. Is that the idea?
Yeah. I've got a nice 03 coming up, so welcome back. But
you gotta have them. And by the way, speaking of welcome back, we've got a special guest on this show. We've got TBS all the way from the other side of the pond, the Ben Seck. Ben, welcome back. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, it's great. It's been too long, really. Honestly, the last time I've been here feels like, I don't know, maybe it was last year. So
it was at the end of last year. Yeah, we kind of flubbed and missed it between the early set in the year and then the next set, and then we had the regular set followed up by MH3 that kind of compressed the timeline too much. So today it's happening. You're here. Oh, and that reminds me, by the way. I need to find them in my email, but I've got preview cards as well that are set to go for today, and we're going to get to talk about those as well. Luis, when do you want to do those?
Let's just do them at the top. I think that probably makes the most sense.
Okay, cool. I should have sent these to Jeff is what I should have done, but in the absence of that, maybe I'll start downloading them here and put them into our chat. But we've got cards from, what is it called? Bloomburrow. Thank you. Yeah, man, there's so many sets now. It's like I feel like I get caught up right when they first start getting previewed. I'm like, oh right, I hear about them at the beginning of the year, and then I don't hear anything until I start seeing the cards come through. We'll go over those. As well. We've got actually 5 of them, and now just be fun to have TBS's take on those as well since we've got them. But first, we want to say thank you to each and every one of our patrons. It's patreon.com/limited resources is where you can find our Patreon page. And again, everybody who supports us there, thank you very much. It kind of provides the backbone for content creators like us, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to do so. If you do sign up, you get a thank you card and a sticker in the mail, no matter what level you sign up for. And again, it's patreon.com/limited resources for that. We also want to say thank you to Ultimate Guard. They sponsor this show with their awesome products. They've just got some of the best stuff out there with regards to protecting your cards, protecting your decks, card sleeves, deck boxes, ways to organize your collection and your decks. And that's why we love them. If you ever go in to their website, ultimateguard.com, you can browse, check out what it is that they have. And then if you find something you like, you can head over to your favorite local game store or your favorite online retailer to find their products. And we think you're really going to like them. And that's why we have them as a sponsor. So if you're interested, again, you can check out their website directly, and then you can head on over to wherever you buy your stuff. And they are very likely to have it there. I put the images in, by the way, so we've got that going for us. Let's take a look at these. I'll start, we'll go Wooburg order here. So we'll start with the white one, which is called Drift Gloom Coyote. It's 3 white for a 3/4 uncommon elemental coyote. It says when it enters, by the way, it just says when Drift Gloom Coyote enters. Is that interesting, or?
That's just kind of new templating, which I think makes a lot of sense.
I think so too. It says exile target creature an opponent controls until Drift Gloom Coyote leaves the battlefield. If that creature had power 2 or less, put a +1/+1 counter on the coyote. What do you think?
It's
a 2-for-1. It eats a creature.
Yeah. I think it's fine. The 5 mana 3/4 is a little bit kind of, it's not the most exciting stat wise. Mm-hmm. But it's not this kind of effect rarely can be too bad. And for the 4 toughness definitely matters for like, you know, avoiding some of the removal. So I think this is like kind of a solid card. I don't think it's like a windmill slam, because even a 5-mana removal spell, even if it's a 2-for-1, sometimes it doesn't come in time.
What do you think, Luis? I mean, this card looks like it would swing a game right back in your direction, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty good card. You're betting a lot on it surviving when you exile something big, and when you exile something small, you get a counter on this. But a lot of the game is going to be whether they can remove it or not. Mm-hmm. I think it's solid at 5 mana. I think it's decent, but not incredible.
Man, you guys are down on it. This card looks awesome to me.
I just think that
like what am I missing here? Like you play this thing on turn 5, you kill whatever their best thing is.
It is a good card. I just think it's just going to be a pretty high leverage card. Like the game's going to swing on whether this card survives or not. And sometimes it will and sometimes it won't.
I guess I see what you're saying, but also like if they kill your creature, like it's not like you're losing that game, right? if they don't, you're winning.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is the investment of 5 mana is obviously significant. Mm-hmm. And if you think of it in a way where you play 5 mana and you get a creature that you don't really want to put into combat, because obviously putting it into combat like pretty high risk, I think that's part of the problem. Like when you have the 3 mana kind of like Fiend Hunter style things, it's okay. It's less punitive basically to not put a 3 mana creature into combat, whereas like a 5 mana investment is like, okay, this like you kind of want to get like what's the back end of it, which is like a 3/4 creature. And then, okay, it's a 3/4 creature or maybe a 4/5, but if it's 4/5, then you're
man,
you know, kind of front side impact is not that high. So I think it's actually, you'll end up being in situations where you cast it, gets rid of a creature, but you can't like attack or block with this thing because you're really, really worried about it.
I will say this card is
are you guys cowards or warriors? Tokens. Like, what is going on here? You can put it into combat.
If you hit something big, you really can't use this in combat all that well.
Why?
Because if it dies, it's really bad for you. Like,
why?
I'm not saying this card.
You're trading a card for it still. Like, it's not like it's that bad for you. They already had the thing before. Like, how is that bad?
I mean, because
you're saying it's worse than a regular removal spell in that scenario because they have the opportunity to get their card back at some point.
Yeah,
basically.
I think there will be times when you would rather have had just a normal removal spell.
I see.
Instead of this.
What you said is true, though, Luis. Tokens, yikes.
Yeah, it's very good on tokens. Look, this is a good card. Like, it's not a bad card. You're going to take it a lot of the times that you see it. I do think that, like TBS said, the 3 mana version of this card, I think typically plays out a little bit better.
Okay, yeah. I think the interesting part about that is, do those die at a high enough clip that you actually would rather have invested this extra mana for the 4 toughness? It kind of depends. I do see some risk there. The blue one is called Long River Lurker. This is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 frog scout at uncommon. It has ward 1 and it gives other frogs you control ward 1. I don't know how relevant that is, but we'll see. And it says when it enters, target creature you control can't be blocked this turn, and whenever that creature deals combat damage this turn, you may exile it. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control.
This card seems awesome.
That's
First of all,
cute.
2/3 ward 1 for a 3 that's giving your other things ward 1 is like going to be pretty annoying for your opponent to deal with. And then just it always gets you basically a vigilance unblockable attack on something. And then if it has an ETB, then you get to get a lot of extra value. I feel like this card is good if you're racing, and it's good if you have ETB stuff. So it's kind of good in a bunch of situations. Fairly powerful card overall.
Yeah, it looks solid to me.
Yeah, I think this card's actually pretty good. Obviously, the density of other frogs will also help how good it is. But I think ETB. There's so many ETBs nowadays.
Yeah.
That it's pretty rare. I mean, think of this as kind of like an uncommon failure. I mean, failure is obviously at really, really good, so it's quite like we're really comparing pretty high. But it's pretty favorable. I think it's.
I don't know what I'd call this failure, but yes, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm just saying it has some of the upside that the failure has, and obviously this is uncommon. It's obviously worse, but it's. I think obviously Felly is incredible. Actually, like it's really one of the best like white creatures they've ever printed for limited in a long time.
And in Cube.
Yeah, and especially Cube. It does everything. This obviously doesn't do everything, but it does some of it.
Black card is called Huskburster Swarm. It's 7 and a black for a 6/6 elemental insect. It's also uncommon. It has menace and death touch. So let's get some cost reduction going here. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature card you own in exile and in your graveyard.
It's pretty context like dependent, though.
Self-mill payoff here.
Yeah, it's a self-mill payoff. I mean, I could see this being actually pretty good and constructed in weird decks, but like, I think this, given enough self-mill, I think this potentially can be good. I just really haven't seen enough of the set to kind of like understand how powerful. Because like, if it gets into play and it's relevant for the board, it's a 2-for-1. I mean, you kind of have to double block it to, it's 6/6 is hard to kill
huge.
with other removals.
Yeah,
it's really big.
Luis, what's the inflection point for this card?
I mean, 3 creatures. Like if you cast this for 5 mana, you're pretty happy.
Yeah, that seems to be already fine, and anything below that, you're kind of jumping for joy, right?
Yeah. So I'm pretty happy with this card. I bet this card's pretty good.
Yeah, this is a classic. How much support does it have? If it's well supported, then that's going to be a really nice payoff. Green card is Bark Knuckle Boxer. Wait, I meant red card, right? Yes, let's go in order here, just to try to not throw any more curveballs at poor Jeff. Red card, Harnesser of Storms. This is 2 and a red for a 1/4 Otter Wizard at uncommon, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature or otter spell, you may exile the top card of your library until end of turn. You may play that card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Wow.
Yeah, this card looks very good. It basically, you get to draw an extra card every time you play a non-creature spell or an otter. Like it's just once a turn, but like still, that's a pretty steady sequence of cards. You get to play lands. Like this card looks like it's going to be a very high pick. I would not pass this card often.
Definitely. Yeah. You always go ahead, TBS.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think the only negative piece is that you have to play the card this turn rather than over the another turn cycle. But I mean, a non-creature obviously really easy to do with regularity for the spell deck. So I definitely think this is draw 3/4 of a card basically every time it triggers.
Yeah, it kind of has all the things that you want there. We look for play versus cast is kind of the big point. Now the green card is called Bark Knuckle Boxer. It is 1 and a green for a 3/2 Raccoon Berserker at uncommon. And it says, whenever you expend 4, Bark Knuckle Boxer gains indestructible until end of turn. And it says, you expend 4 as you spend your 4th total mana to cast spells during a turn.
So
I think that mechanic is pretty cool because it basically just rewards you for what you want to be doing anyway, which is like tapping out, spending all your mana.
It reminds me of Landfall. Right? Where it's like, I wanted to do that anyway. It's something that happens in the natural course of the game that you don't have to work super hard for.
So I'm going to be, let's call it I won't say I'm a naysayer. Implicitly what this does is if you want to attack with it, kind of like, because you want it to be indestructible while you're attacking, you basically have to tap 4 mana in your pre-combat main phase, which means that you can't do tricks as much. So let's say you cast a 4 mana creature, you attack with this creature. It's just very, very hard to kind of like interact in combat on a turn where you had to play 4 mana first. Again, obviously it's stated very aggressively. It's a 2 mana 3/2. It's just that the downside is actually kind of like, I'm not doing tricks. What you see is what you get. So it's hard to kind of like get those kind of advantages during an attack. That being said, the stats are good, so it's probably good enough.
Yeah, I mean, if you can spend the 4 mana during combat, you can I mean, it doesn't care when it is difficult. I think that, the normal thing would be to be you're curving out, like you said. So you're like, play your 4-drop creature attack with my boxer. It's indestructible. Yep. If you had a flash creature instance, some way to cast spells, during combat, you could, but I agree. That's probably not something that'll come up very often.
I mean, I think that's going to be kind of cool way it plays out where, you got no tricks, but what are they going to do? Block your indestructible creature? Like, it's going to work out just fine for you. And I think it'll be kind of neat. There's some bluffing with this too.
Definitely.
All right, I'll cast a 2-drop and attack with this. And you
that's true.
What is your play?
That's good. Yeah, that's fun. That's a cool threat of activation that they're really going to have to make their mind up on whether you have it or not. Interesting. So this set looks pretty cool. I'll be posting these on the website as well for anybody that wants to check them out on LRcast. It'll be, on the Patreon, but I put them as open to everybody on there, so anybody can. You don't have to be a patron to look at those posts, and I'll put them on Twitter too. Okay, let's answer our Patreon question of the week, and then we will get into the meat and potatoes of this show. We're going to be talking about Stronghold and Exodus as we go back in time. But first, we got a question from Marco who says, "Hi, Luis and Marshall and TBS. Thanks for taking our questions. I'm wondering about your thoughts on the design skeleton that Mark Rosewater detailed in his column. You've hypothesized for a long time that R&D had some sort of template that they use for sets, and you were right. It's interesting to see Mark Rosewater give so much detailed information, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it now that you've been proved right. I wonder if there's even enough material there to do a show on. Thanks so much. LR is awesome, and I look forward to the show each week." Thanks, Marco. Did you guys get a chance to see this? He put this out earlier this year. Rosewater did. I read the article. It was really interesting. He went very in depth about this, but yeah, I mean, it was what we thought. I mean, it made sense, but they definitely have a lot of checkboxes, is how I would put it, that they use for either all or most sets to kind of fill in a rough framework of types of cards that they want for each color. And then they can kind of fill in the tapestry in between. TBS, you've been in the game design and games, behind the scenes on Game Space for a long time. What's your take on that? Are you surprised to see that?
No, not at all. I mean, like it's pretty apparent just by the card files that come out, and I think you feel it kind of implicitly just by how consistent the limited sets are in general, like just the quality level. So I think in general, it's. I don't want to say it's obvious, but I think anyone who's looking for it can basically see this template. What I do, look, Mark Rosewater basically has trained a generation of game designers, and he's thought about game design in a long time. I mean, a lot of how I got into game design was like reading his articles a long time ago, and I think he has a very methodical and kind of strategic way to approach these things. What I think is actually pretty cool is how each kind of lead designer interprets this kind of like structure and changes it, because you can see there's actually there's still quite a lot of room for the designers to actually kind of flex their muscle. And we find it actually, we always say Dave Humphries, sets are the GOAT because he's able to kind of leverage he's still working within that structure, but he's actually able to kind of weave a lot of kind of, let's call it kind of fun complexity into his things. And you see some other designers that, they take a different take, and then not necessarily, well, maybe a little bit worse, but not, it feels very different from set to set. Now, I think maybe there's a little bit too much templatization. I think I wish they'd stretch it a little bit more, but I actually think this is a good way to maintain quality level, and I think this is not just expected. I think it's correct to do so in most cases.
Yeah, what do you think? I think it really makes sense to have the skeleton, because, like you said, it's not only quality level, but it's also kind of like consistency between the two, between set to set, and overall, we've had a pretty good run of limited sets. It's not saying they're perfect. I think you do lose a little bit of creativity where at the high end, maybe someone would have had a fantastic idea for a set that didn't really pan out because of this structure, they had to stick to the structure. But I don't think that's that big of an issue. And overall, I think that we get really high quality sets as a result.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it makes sense just because you can take the things that worked well and that you've learned and then start to apply them forward, which is, I mean, that's kind of a human thing, right? That we take our knowledge base and push it forward. And since they're iterating by doing minimum 4 sets a year in this way, it makes sense to hang on to the good stuff and not just be flailing around. I'll put a link to that article, by the way, in the show notes if anybody wants to read it, because he went super deep. I mean, literally they number out, like, here's the commons, here's what they're going to have, here's what they usually have, here's the checkboxes that we want to hit for white for each color, and they go right down the list, and then the uncommons as well.
You know what the great thing about all that is? A really talented visionary designer will just know when not to follow it, and they'll make an argument, and they're the ones in charge. Like, if they had a great idea for why, like, you know what, this time green doesn't get a 5-dropper or whatever, that would just fly. Like, no one's going to tell them no if they can have a good idea, a good argument for it. So I don't see this as a bad thing. I do think that, like, maybe the less visionary or slightly less talented, like, leads, when one does come along, this could be a downside in that it, like, maybe constrains them too much, or it comes out kind of feeling like, all right, everything's the same. But you're going to run into that issue if you have someone leading a set who's not good anyway. So, like, this, I think, on balance, this doesn't constrain a great design and will bring up the floor significantly, which is, I think, exactly what they should be doing.
Yeah. So I think the other piece of it too is with design, if you don't have good structure or good kind of frameworks, design can be very, very kind of like tribal knowledge, so to speak, where, like, it can be lost over generations of designers. What this allows, like, newer designers to do is kind of like stand on the shoulders of previous designers, where they have been able to kind of learn from their mistakes, and maybe they don't even have to be told explicitly why they've made this decision, but you can kind of, like, as Luis is saying, like, bring up the floor of it, as well as kind of like, as a designer, you'll go over each slot and say, okay, why did they choose that? And then if you're thoughtful enough, you'll be able to kind of reverse engineer the reasons for those changes. So
yeah,
like I mean, Magic design has been happening for 30 plus years. You can't know it all. It's just very, very hard to do so. And so you need to kind of, like, have those structures so you can to avoid some of the pitfalls that have happened in the past. And I think that this is a good way of doing it. Again, you should, think about it. And as Louis said, know when to break it. But I think overall you want to have this body of knowledge kind of, like, passed over generations.
Yeah, and I think you touched on an important point from our perspective as limited players. How is it useful to us? And I mean, that's what led us down the road of having this idea that we talked about on the show, where it, as you said, TBS, it became obvious that there was some type of template. I just was curious about what it actually looked like and how it was implemented. And Rosewater, kind of laid that out for us. But for us, we're reverse engineers, right? Like, limited players are looking at, I'm trying to figure out what the designers are telling me. Right. The signposts on commons are kind of the loudest signal that we get before a set comes out for us to grab onto something. But there's a lot more there. There's a lot where you can see when a card's been pushed, when you can see when a card's been nerfed, when you can see, and again, reverse engineer how these cards came together. So great question. Thanks, Marco, for that. We appreciate it. Okay, let's get into our main topic, and that is going to be little blast from the past here. We're continuing our march. We started with our alpha set review back in the day with TBS, and we have now arrived at the second part of the Tempest block saga, which is Stronghold and Exodus. Those are the 2 sets that followed Tempest and completed the Tempest block. Stronghold was the 13th Magic expansion. It came out in March of 1998, and again, it was the second set from the Tempest block, and then Exodus was the 14th one that came out in June of 1998, and it filled in that third and final slot for that. One thing to keep in mind that is something that's really foreign to us at this point, but these are both small sets, and we don't have small sets anymore. In fact, we only have huge sets, but back in the day, there would be one full-size set followed by 2 small sets. Total number of cards in each of these sets, 143. These were very, very much smaller card pool compared to the huge sets that we get every single time now. So what was the context for these TBS when Stronghold and Exodus came out after Tempest?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of clarify the limited context for these, and we often talk about draft. So at the time, as you said, the sets were kind of set in blocks, and there were three set blocks. But initially, the first of the block was this Tempest, and you draft Tempest, and that makes sense
for 3 months or whatever.
Right, yeah. And then the next set comes out. Now, instead of like if the people who have drafted blocks, you start with the most recent set and go backwards. No, it's opposite. In fact, it's actually a bit different, where it's actually Tempest, like Stronghold when it came out. So actually, Stronghold has a very, very small impact in the drafting. In fact, it doesn't do any of the driving when it comes to the draft. Like you're choosing Tempest cards and then kind of like choosing your Stronghold cards based on the context of your Tempest cards. And that's the same for Exodus. Exodus was put onto the end, so it's Tempest, Stronghold, Exodus. And so when it comes to limited impact, a lot of times you kind of like pretty small for the new sets, because you had to have made your color choices or your strategy choices at the beginning of the draft. And so it's just diluted a little bit. So a lot of these sets are much more kind of like constructed impact than they are limited impact. That being said, there's a lot of interesting things going on still. It's just that, at the time, often it didn't really matter that much to kind of driving the limited environment.
Luis, do you remember drafting in the reverse or in the order like that when they they came out?
I mean, that's just the way you did it. And I'm surprised in retrospect how long it took to move away from that, because of all the things that Ben just said, where it's like, you already set in your colors. You had to like balance. How do the designers had to balance, like how, let's say use energy as a theme. Energy is very parasitic. So if you have energy in the first set, you either have to have it in the subsequent sets, or you end up in a spot where those cards don't work. And like, good luck introducing a new mechanic in the third set where you're like, oh, now I'm supposed to care about this thing. And it's
some afterthought. Yeah.
It's just really crazy how different that can be. So I think overall it's much better to do it this way, but it was fun when a new set came out. I mean, Magic Draft's really fun. Like, no one was really that worried about it,
Yeah, I think the two things that I wanted to mention about this. One, this predates Magic Online still. Magic Online has actually been out for a really long time. It came out in 2002, but this is still 4 years before that. So any drafting that happened in the world happened with people sitting around a table. And that meant that it just happened so much less frequently. If you found somebody that had done 20 drafts in a format, that would just be like, what? Like, how?
I mean, Kai built an empire by just having 7 other dudes in Cologne, Germany he could draft with 10 times a week.
Totally, right? And those type of reps where you can really, because drafting's hard, it's complex. That's why this podcast exists. But we have way more tools now with online drafting plus 17 lands plus podcasts like this. The knowledge base is much, much more developed than it was then. So you did have a lot more novelty where you weren't being, or not us, but the Wizards of the Coast wasn't being punished as hard from the frailty really of this setup. I mean, because the other thing that comes to mind is these are only 143 card sets total. So, you kind of knew what you were going to get. I mean, the commons, you would see them all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also the commons of the earlier set, impact the strategy. Like, one of the reasons why I think Stronghold and Exodus on a common level is so kind of like generic is because they can't have that much. They have to be very, very flexible in what kind of decks they can go into. So there's a lot more kind of like bland creatures or very bland effects. And again, as you said, it's a small set. Just to give a small anecdote, I mean, I know you said that Magic Online hadn't been released. At the time, there was actually a pretty, I would say it's not as lively as the Discord cube drafts, but there's actually a very lively net draft scene. For those who
I played on that actually on like IRC and stuff, like where people would, there was you use like I guess Apprentice at the time, I think it was what it was, to play the games, which was basically like cockatrice, where like a third party program that had no rules enforcement, but you could shuffle decks and put cards into play and represent them, and like you play against someone unreasonable who just like quit the game, or they like start drawing extra cards, and that could all happen. But I remember drafting on those, and it was awesome. I was like, I get to draft from home? Are you kidding me?
Oh yeah, and some of the kind of the limited greats at the time, part of their edge was they could get dozens more reps than the average person playing in real life, because as you said, you have to get 8 people together. In fact, like, even before kind of like, Kai kind of like had his like rise, he was on this net draft scene, and part of how he got better and how all of us got better, myself included. I mean, I happen to have a big edge over my local community because like I drafted probably, 20 times more than them because, one, it didn't cost anything to net draft like back then, but also I was playing against like players who were like, world class at the time when it came to limited, just because of reps. Reps is like a huge amount, especially when everyone is starved for the amount of play they can do. Now everyone's kind of like, we're all feasting on like Arena and MTGO.
Now the problem is the opposite.
Yes, that's right. And 17 lands being kind of the most extreme like piece of that, where it was like, I have so much data that I don't even kind of need to know. I can just kind of read what the crowd, and the crowd will get you, let's call it 60, 70% of the way of like understanding card evaluations. Now, obviously, that 30% is big. But
I mean, to give you a sense of like how a way you do that is our friend Pat Cox, who doesn't really engage with Magic except on the Arena Opens because he's very competitive, loves tournaments. At this point, isn't traveling for them or anything.
And he loves money. My God, that man.
That's him. But he, before an Arena Open, he'll start texting me about Magic. That's how I can tell an Arena Open is coming, because we talk about random stuff, but then he starts talking about Magic like, oh, you must be practicing for this. He'll look at 17 lands while drafting and basically use that it's the 80-20 thing. He'll get 80% of the value out of this, and then he'll still draft to try to like make some of his own opinions and sharpen up and like figure out the decks he wants. But he's a player who used to be highly engaged, doesn't play that much anymore, and 17 lands can shortcut. If he was going to spend 20 hours prepping, well, that's an exaggeration, but let's say he wanted 20 hours worth of value, 17 lands get you 15 of those hours. You spend 5 hours. You don't have to figure out from first principles, is this 4-drop good? 17 lands shows you it's great.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to point out was what you said, TBS, which was that, being that the cycles were so much slower with how many drafts people got to do, the level of information that was out there. I mean, this is like terrifying to think of now from a game design perspective, but they had to stick the landing on the big set. Like, imagine if the big set just stunk. Like, the small sets were not saving you. Like, they did not fundamentally change the landscape. If it just sucked to draft, or they did one major mistake, everybody's up in arms now about Writhing Chrysalis. If there's a card like that, you're just stuck with it for the better part of a year. I mean, it was brutal, because the small sets, again, TBS brought this up, but it's really important to note here. You could not introduce new build around mechanics after the first set. They didn't work. You would only ever get one pack out of that set. So your only option was to have it already built into the main set. Now, you could introduce new mechanics, right? Ones that didn't require critical mass or anything like that. Sure, you could do that, and they might be interesting, but those are usually like standalone interesting, not format changing interesting.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think also part of that is you also, I mean, we saw that with some sets we'll talk about in the future, like Mercadian Masks had kind of like a very, very weak kind of, they were trying to reset after Urza Saga. And it really affected the tone of not just limited, but constructed. And and honestly, the interest went down. I mean, there was kind of a little bit of kind of like, it was the first, well, not the first. It was one of the early kind of downturns of like Magic popularity because they didn't really stick the landing with their big set, especially after Urza Saga, which is kind of like, yeah, it had its own problems, but it was at least an exciting set. Now, Mercadian Advance went all the way to the other side where it was like really boring and repetitive. It's like, had a lot of really big issues, both constructed and limited.
Well, it's funny because they made mistakes with Urza Saga. Like the number of cards that were just out of control, way too good, to the detriment of Magic there. I mean, this is the set that brought you Time Spiral, Tolarian Academy, Yawgmoth's Will, Gaia's Cradle, like Memory Jar, like just like on and on and on. Like that block was just like outrageous. To then get the to think like, oh, we made that mistake. Let's make a much, much, much worse mistake, in my opinion, of going to Mercadian Masks. Everything's a 3 out of 10 world. Like, yes, it is better to not make the mistake to begin with. But if you're going to make a mistake, it's better to brick high than brick low. And they certainly decided to brick low afterwards.
Yeah.
All right. Should we do Crack-a-Packs to kind of give us a glimpse of what it would be like to open up one of these packs and kind of put us into that world?
Let's do it.
Okay. So we'll start off with Stronghold. And our first card, I remember this one. It's Lowland Basilisk. This is 2 and a green for a 1/3 that has Death Touch-ish.
Yeah.
Death Touch didn't exist at the time, so it says whenever it damages any creature, destroy that creature at end of combat.
I think this is a pretty low impact, if I remember, card, just because, it's like, at 1 power, it's, you didn't care if you blocked it. So it's purely a blocking kind of like, death touch creature, and 3 mana. It's just not that efficient. So yeah, it was playable, but it wasn't particularly good.
What do you think about it, Luis?
Yeah, part of the problem with it was that a lot of the creatures that would kill you had shadow, so it's just not that good at stopping those. And it's an okay card, but it was certainly not great.
Yep.
Next card is Conviction, which is 1 and a white for an enchant creature. I'm going to read it as it was, printed.
Oh yeah.
Enchanted creature gets +1/+3, and you can pay white to return Conviction to its owner's hand.
This card actually surprisingly good. So so if you back then, Hero's Resolve, which is essentially the first kind of like
Fat pants.
really, people call it pants, and then people used to call this underwear because it was a little smaller.
Well, I don't know about that. TBS
No. And you could take them off. So it was like I don't know exactly how the story went there. But I think
you guys played Magic a little differently in Australia than we did. But sounds fun.
Yeah.
So Conviction was really, really good in actually the Shadow decks that Luis was talking about, because one of the vulnerabilities of Shadow is like the creatures generally have very low toughness, and there's quite a lot of pingers and like 1 damage effects that are happening. And so what this allowed them to do is actually to kind of like, 1, increase some of the threat because it added a power, but actually even more important, it could kind of like protect it from some of the like damage removal, and also it would win shadow fights, as in the 3 toughness would essentially make it impossible to block, and with shadow creatures already having kind of low toughness, you would just win those fights. And also, if they finally got like a terror or a terror, like a kind of murder effect, you could just sort of bring it back to your hand, so you wouldn't like lose the card advantage as much as you normally would. So actually, a kind of surprisingly impactful card for this format.
Kind of a meta thing about these, but it stands out when you look at these packs, is just how many of the 1-word card names are get used up and how quickly they burn through them. And I mean, in many cases, how they feel kind of wasted. I mean, this card is called Conviction. Like, that is a sweet name. Like, I want that to be awesome. And it's like this like weird, mediocre, like underpants card or whatever. Like, I'm not that impressed. Next is Spindrift Drake? Is that what your new nickname should be, Luis? Are you the Spindrift Drake?
I do require a steady upkeep of Spindrift to keep me going.
Yeah.
This is the 1 mana blue for a 2/1 flyer, and during your upkeep you had to pay a blue or sacrifice it. And we're still in this like kind of era where I'll defer to TBS about how good these cards are in limited. We leave it soon enough and never go back to that. Don't worry. But there's definitely an era where he knows a lot better than me when it comes to draft. And Spindrift Drake was the kind of card I thought was awesome. I was like, wow, this card's so cool. I don't think it was particularly good though.
Yeah, it was definitely a trap. I think like, look, it's a 1 mana 2/1 flyer, and you go, wow, okay, like, and so you kind of like incentivize to play at turn 1, but basically you stone rain yourself on turn 1 for a good amount of turns. Now, obviously, you could just choose not to pay, or if it trades. The thing is, when it's a 2/1 flyer, there's actually not that much trading happening with it, so you kind of like stuck with it, or like you lose your card advantage. Again, it's not terrible because it can put a clock on the opponent, but often curving out was just better than having to pay this turn after turn. Again, it's not like horrible, but also it just never really kind of worked out in the way that you needed it to.
Yeah, and this is, of course, also, from an era when game design wasn't quite as polished as it would become later. And they still, this isn't cumulative upkeep, but it's, cards routinely still had things on them that were bad for you. So you played your own card and it was bad for you. And they thought that was an interesting trade-off, but I think that, at some point they realized that people just didn't like paying these type of costs. Next is Elven Right. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery. It says put 2+1/+1 counters distributed any way you choose on any number of target creatures.
Mediocre.
Yeah.
We can probably, it was fine.
Okay, that isn't the way to get ahead even in the good old days, huh?
Yeah.
Next is Provoke. This is 1 and a green for an instant. Untap target creature you do not control. That creature blocks this turn if able. But this is pretty cool. Provoke is a cantrip. It draws you a card too.
Yeah, so this is kind of their first attempt to try and like give green, well, not the first, but like one of the early attempts to give green removal. Now they eventually got to fight or to bite style.
But that took a long time, right?
A long time.
Yeah,
and so
this is a very rudimentary version.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they were very reticent to give green any sort of direct damage, which they, like, even directed to the creature.
It's just so sick that this card couldn't kill shadow creatures, even though that's the one thing green really wanted to do.
Yeah, that's funny. And fight would be really good against them, right? Because they were all small. Oh, man, that's funny. That's cool, though. That's some DNA there that, now has come. I mean, now the fight cards, and they're almost all bite cards. They're mostly instants. They're cheaps. A bunch of them buff up the creature. I mean, they're really, really strong now. But this is a first little stab at that.
Just wait till we get to Scourge and Deathbleed Elite. If you want to talk about Provoke, it has what the mechanic that became Provoke, like, which is untap creature, force it to block, and like there was some losing your creature every single turn to that. But
that's tough.
We'll get there. It's only a couple sets away, so we'll probably get there in only 3 or 4 years. Something like that.
Next is Dungeon Shade, which is 3 and a black for a 1/1 flying spirit, and you can pay black to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. So pretty classic Shade here.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of mana to get a 1/1 flyer. So it basically this is tempo wise too bad. It's a threat. I definitely saw people draft this at the time. I don't think it was a good idea mostly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were monocolored decks a thing?
Not intentionally, but sometimes people would push it that way.
Leap is next. It is blue for an instant. Guess what it does? Target creature gains flying until end of turn, but this one's pretty nice. You get to draw a card.
I mean, it's good that it's a cantrip. So this is Provoke, just kind of as Luis said before, like because the Tempest was so shadow heavy, flying and kind of like things that didn't interact with shadow very well weren't particularly good. Obviously, it replaces itself, so how bad could it be? But like often they couldn't block anyway, so giving flying doesn't help that much. And so there was just a smaller piece of the combat pie that was kind of like interacting outside Shadow. And so it's not as good as it would kind of reads.
Yeah, the other thing, and again, TBS, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it felt, at least to me when I was drafting back then, especially compared to now, is you had so few good cards in your deck. Like you had a lot more air. So putting cards like this in your deck, I don't think, like on the one hand, maybe it can like find your one big card or whatever, but most of the time it's like you want each of your spells to kind of do something because the games will go long. And this probably was at least somewhat a symptom of me and the people I was drafting with being bad at draft. But overall, I do think that like cantrips and card draw in some ways were less good when you just had fewer good cards to find.
Yeah. I think, look, nowadays you will always struggle to cut the card in your deck. And now back then you would always be struggling to find the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd card. Mm-hmm. So I think like overall the kind of paradigm of like how many playables you have available has changed. And that actually means that things like you have a deck full of C's is not a train wreck, whereas it would have definitely been a train wreck in modern times. And what Leap does sometimes is actually kind of makes you flood a lot because it's hard to actually kind of get a critical mass of stuff, and there's not as much kind of like mana spending kind of mechanics. Yeah, mana sinks, and so a card like that kind of like gets you more effective land in your deck actually kind of like is even more punishing than usual.
Also interesting to note that, you know, Leap is just a strictly better jump, right? From Alpha.
Yes.
Kind of interesting that they're going back and, you know, rewriting history a little bit already. We're only 5 years into Magic at this point.
Well, it's funny because they have that, and then they have like Shock, which is strictly worse Bolt. Like,
yeah, it shows that they learned.
They had learned at this point which were too good, which weren't.
That's really good. Flowstone Shambler is next. It's 2 and a red for a 2/2 beast. By the way, this was a common stat line, right? A 3-mana 2/2 was kind of a standard issue baseline, and then they'd throw something else onto it. In this case, you can pay red to give it +1, -1 until end of turn.
D+.
I think it's a little better than that. It kills shadow creatures for red, basically. You put it on their 2/1 and you kill it.
No, that's the
This is a creature, Luis.
This is a creature.
Oh, I thought it was Flowstone Blade. Sorry,
Yeah,
I don't look at the Kraka packs because
because you just know all the cards anyway. But yeah, this one's the Shambler, the 2/2 that has the Flowstone.
Oh yeah,
ability.
that guy was pretty mid. Just a 3-mana creature that sometimes could trade up. Like it was it'd probably be surprising to you how bad the creature quality was, but this one was still not a very good one.
Yeah, that seems right. Next is Samite Blessing. This is white for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gains tap, prevent all damage to any creature from any one source.
Okay,
that seems really annoying.
Yeah, well, but I'll give you a cheat sheet. Like basically all auras, or what are known now as auras, were essentially just bad because you can't afford to give yourself like a 2-for-1, even if you could kind of gum up the board. So
if this were to stick around, it might be interesting, but it's just if your creature died, you just were going to lose. Yeah,
it's just too bad, and the impact is too small. Like the card has got to give you more than like this effect. Next is Sky Shroud Archer. This is green for a 1/1 elf, and you can tap it to have creature with flying get -1/-1 until end of turn. I know it looks like in theory it'd be okay, and it's not like terrible, but the fact is most of the evasive creatures were shadow. And so this didn't this didn't affect the board as much. I remember boarding in it against my friend who had 3 Spindrift Drakes in his deck, and that was good though.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time this card just didn't really work. It also is the kind of card they typically don't do anymore, which is like straight up on the board. You play this, they play a creature. You're just like, okay, tap this, kill your creature. Like they try to avoid that sort of situation because it's just not very fun when that happens.
Now, if you were to open up a pack of Stronghold and get to this point, you would be at the uncommons, but you wouldn't have any way to know that looking at the pack. Now, that will change actually with our next set that we're going to do. But this set, the set symbols were all the same still up until this point. So this one is called Calming Lycid. And this is going to be a good way for you guys to talk about Lycids. This is 2 and a white for a summon Lycid, which is a creature. It's a 2/2. And you can pay, this is what it says on the card. You can pay white, tap it. Calming Lycid loses this ability and becomes a creature enchantment that reads, quote, enchanted creature cannot attack, end quote, instead of a creature. Move Calming Lycid onto target creature. You may pay white to end this effect. So it turns itself into an aura, basically, right? That's what it does.
Yeah. So, I mean, Lycids at the time were considered like some of the, not just wordiest, but like most kind of unintuitive, like things. But I can understand how they kind of came about, because someone says, oh, what if you had something that could kind of like, jump on and off? And, from a top-down perspective, I kind of understand where they're going for it. But the problem is like there's a lot of this weirdness about how they play out. And also, it was one of the earliest times you could actually get a tapped enchantment, which is also people were confused about, because like tapped artifacts didn't work. So did tapped enchantments work? Like there was this, I mean,
the most shocking thing about Lycids is how many sets they were in. This is such, like, even back then, this is a bad mechanic. It's so confusing and unbelievable. Like,
you're totally right.
How did they keep making these things? That's the part that I just want to know.
They were trying to make fetch happen, and it was like, it's not happening. Because even if you get the intuitive part, right? Because the flavor behind these, right, is they're like the things from Alien, right? That like jump on you and augment you in some way or hurt you in some way. So you're thinking, okay, what if I could have my creature jump onto you, attach itself to your spine or your face, and make you better or worse in some way? Right. Like you can understand that, but that's not that cool. Right. Like that's not like.
Even worse than that, the actual kind of like biggest utility for Lycids, in limited at least, was to actually like block an opponent's attacking creature and then jump it onto something. Oh. So it's basically a way of like kind of fogging an individual creature. It had very little
super fun.
Right. Like, yeah. It's just like so they just couldn't attack one of their creatures, and then you just have to spend 2 mana basically jumping it on and off. And it was just kind of annoying and had nothing to do with the actual ability the Lycid did a lot of the time, because the main usage was to kind of like just not be there when damage got dealt. And this is before damage on the stack, and I know we don't have damage on the stack now, but like it was even before that. So you couldn't even get kind of like the block, do damage, and move it kind of trick. So let me tell you, this is just like play pattern-wise terrible. This card is actually one of the better lists because it actually does something kind of relevant.
It has a real effect.
Yeah, real effect for you, like because it's a pacifism essentially. But still, I mean, like F- design, I hate lists.
Yeah, lists suck.
They're horrendously bad.
This one sucks too. It doesn't even fully pacify. It's only they can't attack. Like, come on. Yeah. Next one. A lot of people's favorites from back in the day.
Well, but see, Marshall, the joke is when if they block, you then pop the Lycid back off to go calm something else.
Right. How did I miss it? Yeah, these Lycids are horrendous. Acidic Sliver is our next uncommon. So this is one of 6 gold cards in the set total. They're all slivers. And this is the black-red version. It is a 2/2 sliver that says each sliver gains. You can pay 2 and sacrifice this creature. This creature deals 2 damage to target creature or player.
Good.
Which is any target now, by the way. But
yeah, I mean, so this is cool, and also it's probably one of the only cards maybe in this whole pack that actually, if you put it into a modern set, it would kind of stand up like on a stat line. It's not like amazing, but it's still not terrible. Mm-hmm. And the effect is like relevant. Bad thing about like all old slivers is that they affected your opponent would also get the ability. And so sometimes I remember one time where my friend had played the Acidic Sliver and I had some other random slivers and I just killed him with his own effects.
Brutal. Brutal. No longer your friend, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, when I say friend, I just mean the guy I was playing at the time. But it was just
I get
think
it. I get it, TBS. They're all just bodies in your wake on your way to GP winning.
look, back in the day, I'd take my wins when I had them. They don't happen that often nowadays. But yeah, it's good that the design basically is kind of like less about punitive, about playing the mirror match. And I think that's actually a smart move that they made in later sets.
Yeah, and these the slivers affecting everything is weird by today's lens, but it's cool. It's also flavorful, and to me it's kind of one of those artifacts from the past that kind of holds up. It's actually kind of cool. You want a big hitter? I mean, these are the type of cards that when they came out, I remember being like, whoa, just because of the mana cost. This is Flame Wave.
Oh, yeah.
It costs 3 red. I mean, that's a mana cost, right? Like, try to imagine what you would get if you told, a game designer now, okay, I'm going to pay 3 and quad red. What do I get? This is what you got back then. A sorcery that does 4 damage to target player and each creature they control. It is a powerful effect.
Yeah.
Do you ever get to 7 mana with quad red, though?
I mean, well, if you play a 2-color deck, it's not like impossible for it to happen if you're like, let's say 10-7 or something like that. I'm not saying it's like you won't get screwed sometimes, but I think overall it was definitely possible. I mean, I saw a lot of people try and play this card. It definitely won the game on occasion because it is that kind of effect. Obviously, it's quite good against smaller creatures too, so it's like very good against shadow creatures.
I mean, back then this was good. Every creature was this size. Like there was very few creatures that lived through Flame Wave.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was actually playable given a certain like mana configuration. I just don't think it was ever kind of like, oh my god, this was like I have to first pick it. It was just kind of like if you could do it, maybe you would put it in your deck.
My guess is that it was good when I was playing because we were bad, but it wasn't actually that good. But the worse people are, the better this card gets because the games go longer, and whoever casts this is winning the game, like 99% or whatever.
Yeah, I think that works.
Is this a particularly bad Stronghold pack? Like, what is our pick? I haven't read the rare yet, but pre-rare, like, is there even a card here? Like, do we have playables?
Honestly, I would probably take Calming Listed or maybe Flame Wave.
Yeah, no, I think Calming Listed would be the clear pick here. Wow. And I don't think Calming Listed generally is kind of the first pickable quality, even for Strongholds.
Is this a bad pack? Or is this what you can expect?
No, I mean, it wasn't like, it's probably like bottom 40%, but not like horrendous.
Okay. Well,
I mean, it's on the bottom half, but not like, it's not like to the bottom.
We got a rare. I don't know if it'll change your mind. It's Awakening, 2 green for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, untap all creatures and lands. Period.
I love this card back then, but it was not for limited reasons.
No. This card was a strong player in Constructed.
Oh, yeah. Okay. There was some combo or something.
Trade Awakening. You had this 1/4 creature, Trade-in Rider.
Trade-in Rider.
1/4 flyer, right? You tap it and 2 other creatures to bounce any permanent, including lands. And with Awakening, you just got to use it on your turn and their turn. So you would just bounce their lands over and over again, and all their stuff, then all their lands.
Yeah, but lands because you don't want other people to have fun. No, I mean, look, this card basically did nothing in limited, like meaningfully, but definitely had a presence in Constructed. So I mean, there's a lot of those cards like you'll see when we actually go through the set. It's like, oh, I remember this card, and it's nearly always for Constructed reasons and not for limited reasons.
Well, you guys are taking the listed.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, not really knowing. I mean, I recognize a bunch of these cards because they kind of floated around when I played, but limited wasn't something that I did, and I wasn't aware of it. If I were to jump into a draft and open this pack, I would take Flame Wave. I would just say, well, these old sets were slow. The creatures were smaller. I'm just going to try to set myself up to cast this thing every turn or every game, recognizing that that's probably not the way that it's actually going to go. But like, I want a goal. I want something to aim for. So I think that's what I would pick. Do you want to do the Exodus Crack-A-Pack now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
okay.
let's do it.
First card out. Is it called Welkin Hawk?
It is.
Okay, because there it is. All right, Welkin Hawk. 1 and a white for a 1/1 flying bird. If Welkin Hawk is put into any graveyard from play, you may search your library for a Welkin Hawk card. Reveal that card to all players and put it in your hand. There you go. Now I get it now. And then shuffle your library afterwards.
So this is the Squadron Hawk Progenitor. Less good because you only get one at a time, so you can't kind of like, have an empty hand and kind of fill them up with hawks. Actually didn't play out very well. I do remember a couple friends trying to kind of like draft around these things, and they would get like 4 and it still wasn't very good.
Yeah, 'cause you can never have more than one at a time. So like you're never doing the thing where you're like hawk, 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 kill you, or hawk, hawk, double block. It was always like hawk, okay, it dies, I get another one. Hawk dies, I get another one.
Just incremental hawks.
It was a trap, which is unfortunate, but
Oh,
it was cool.
Okay, next card is called Shieldmate. It is white for a 1/1 soldier, and you can sacrifice it to give target creature +0/+4 until end of turn.
Yeah.
That is no mate of mine.
Yeah, no, you didn't say it properly. That's a shield, mate.
I should have had you read it. Yeah. You're actually qualified.
That's right. Yeah. It's just an Australian telling someone that they have a shield.
But this Australian would not tell people to actually play this card, right?
No, this card is bad.
Okay. Next is Reaping the Rewards. It's white for an instant, and it has buyback. You can sacrifice a land. So if you pay the buyback cost when you cast it, instead of putting the card in the graveyard, you put it into your hand again. The effect, you gain 2 life.
It was a Zern Orb. You get to cast Zern Orb over and over again.
Nothing like paying lands to gain 2 extra life.
Yeah, it was just a different time back then. A lot of these cards really just aren't that good.
Like, this is painful. Like, TBS, when you see these cards, are you just kind of rolling your eyes at this point, or?
So okay, this card is clearly bad, especially in a bi-model lens. You'd be shocked how many people play this card.
Oh yeah,
people would play. Like, yeah, because people say, "Oh, I'm going to die." It's kind of like it buys me an extra turn. They have to do more. Like it people play this. Like, I would say, every draft that would have a player, and granted, you go to your local store, the quality of players are not that high, but I'm saying every draft there would be a player playing this card. This is not like an exaggeration. And this card is like bad. And even like the good players at the time knew it was bad, but still the knowledge of what limited, how it worked was just not great enough to kind of like see that this card was was unplayable. So
I mean, we're still in the era where like it was considered pioneering to figure out that you wanted 17 lands instead of 14 or whatever.
Okay. That's good context. Because, I mean, when we first started doing the podcast, we had to tell people not to play cards that only gained you life. And it led to, sometimes interesting discussions about, well, what would that number be? But that problem solved itself because they don't print those cards anymore. Like, look at the last 10 sets and you're not going to find cards that are just like, pay mana, get life. That's it. Like, those just aren't a thing anymore. Next card up is called Bequeathal. This is green for an enchant creature. If enchanted creature is put into any graveyard, draw 2 cards.
1 mana.
See, here's the funny thing. It's in green, which can't kill creatures.
True. Is this as bad as it looks?
It's worse, actually.
Yeah.
It's just like it. You just can't afford like air like this. Also drawing cards just not as good too back then. Like, I mean, drawing cards like this, like conditionally, is just really, really kind of like, the best case scenario is very mediocre.
It seems very tough. Next is Thrall Surgeon. This is 1 and a black for a 1/1 Thrall. Is this an uncommon actually? No, it's not. You can pay 1 and a black and sacrifice it to look at target player's hand and choose one of those cards. That player discards that card, and you can do this at sorcery speed.
It's so funny that they figured out that they shouldn't let you do this at instant speed, but they didn't figure out like how to write Death Touch. It's just kind of interesting to see how that all evolved. And this is definitely not criticism of the designers. It's just kind of funny seeing, in one sense, like they figured out like, hey, it's really bad and really obnoxious to discard during people's draw steps. But on the other hand, like, let's, print some like cards with buyback or print licids or whatever that are just like really hilariously unfun to play with.
Yeah. Next is Furnace Brood. 3 and a red for a 3/3 elemental, and you can pay red to have target creature cannot be regenerated this turn. Oh boy, we're in 1998 for sure here, boys. I mean, wow.
So, funnily enough, I think this is probably the first card that I would have drafted, like as in, not the first card I've drafted, but like as
you would have selected out of this pack.
I would have selected out of this pack. And purely by rate, and that seems ridiculous because the rate is terrible. But like often you would play Hill Giant creatures just for stats. I wouldn't say that I wanted it to be in my deck, but like I would say it was kind of the power level was at such that often you wouldn't cut it from your deck, and that's shows you kind of the power level of it, because like the
I don't think you're ever cutting a Hill Giant from your deck, really?
No,
right?
I don't think so. No, pretty much never, and that's kind of like where you're at.
Next is Dizzying Gaze. It is red for an enchant creature, and it says put Dizzying Gaze only on a creature you control, and you can pay red to have enchanted creature deal 1 damage to target creature with flying. Oh, God.
Yeah, I mean,
No.
Terrible. This card's really bad. I talked about auras just being bad in general. This is like not only a bad aura, but also a bad play pattern, because like, oh, your opponent has flying creatures, they never get to play another one. It's just not very, very fun. But also bad, just because, as I said before, auras are not very good, and also killing flying creatures is not that good in this format because of Shadow. Funnily enough, we haven't seen a Shadow creature, but
are there any in this set or the prior? Or are they all in Tempest?
There are a couple at higher rarities.
Okay, but they're mostly in Tempest.
Yeah, but Tempest kind of dominates a lot of
right.
how it was perceived.
And played. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Fade Away is next. It's 2 and a blue for a sorcery. For each creature, that creature's controller pays 1 or sacrifices a permanent.
So, a pretty brutal card if you could land it, but I don't think was really that good. This is kind of confusing to me, though.
So what happens here? So like you're trying to catch your opponent tapped out.
Yeah.
And then for every creature they have to sacrifice a permanent if they have no mana to spend.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of people try this. Here's the problem. Everyone was kind of like really bad at drafting, so curving out was actually really unusual. So there's always this like mana lying around.
So it'd be better now somehow?
Yeah, maybe, because
I don't think they'd make this card now. It just sounds like such a whammy. Also,
does.
Imagine the world where this card exists, where you're like, I guess I shouldn't go 2, 3, 4 because Fade Out will kill me. All right, I'll play a weaker card on turn 3 to leave mana up. You always have to think ahead. Like, really sounds like it's the great combination of like frustrating when it works, annoying to play around, but you're supposed to, but also not that good. Like,
yeah.
it's really something.
Yeah, I mean, I never really saw a good fade away deck, but
if you want to see a good fadeaway, come to basketball with me tonight.
Boom.
Next is Reclaim. This is a card that I remember the artwork for it for sure. It's green for an instant. Put target card from your graveyard on top of your library.
A lot of people thought this card was excellent when it came out because it was kind of like, regrowth was, still had a bit of a halo around that effect, and just looked really close because you could play it end of turn, you could take the, your best card and draw it. But it's just intrinsically card disadvantage in a time where card advantage was actually really, really important because the card quality was so bad.
Yeah, this seems like a little bit of a skill tester too, right? Just people mistaking it for a card like Regrowth. Next is Onslaught. Just the name of the card is Onslaught. It's red for an enchantment, and it says whenever you successfully cast a creature spell, tap target creature. Take that. Tap
kind
something.
Of good. It's good on turn 1 and bad pretty much every other turn. Because if you did understand kind of mana curve, which people didn't at the time, you could kind of just get a huge roll on. Just a really, really kind of, I say swingy. I don't mean swingy as I guess a little bit swingy, but when you draw it really matters, and it's just not good enough drawing it even past turn 3.
And it just seems like the aggressive strategies just aren't backed up by these cards, right? I mean, even a reasonable curve out of creatures is still only going to net you a 1/1 and a 2/2 and a 3/3 or something, right? You can't slam the door on the game.
Yeah, and half the decks don't block because of Shadow. I know we keep talking about Shadow, but Shadow is really, really important here. So if Shadow wasn't even blocking, this card does nothing. They're just racing on their own turns.
Have our first uncommon, and as I mentioned before, really interesting. This is where the mana symbol actually starts to, or the set symbol, starts to turn color. So we see it's silver here. It's a bridge, right? That's what that is for Exodus. I think the symbol is supposed to be a bridge. Anyway, and it's very clear. They made it very silver. It's a kind of a negative space type design, so they really could show off the gold and the silver for the other rarities. Kind of cool. That stuck around. It's called Zealots Endal, and it is 3 and a white for a 2/4 soldier. And it says during your upkeep, if all non-land permanents you control are white, you gain 1 life. They would not print that card today.
But actually, funnily enough, probably best card on rate for back then.
Okay.
Yeah. Reasonably large, could gain you life every turn.
Yeah.
Because that is the thing that's standing out is there's just not that much power and toughness to go around. If you look at the pack we've opened here, total power that we've opened so far is 3, 4, 5, 6, and then with this card 8 total.
Yeah.
That's of all the cards in all the pack that we've got here from Exodus. I mean, there's just not that many creatures with, that actually hit. So yeah, that card actually looks decent. Next is Elven Palisade. And that's not going to add to our power count. It's green for an enchantment. You can sacrifice a forest to have target attacking creature get -3/-0 until end of turn.
Wow, what another really fun card to have.
Yeah, wow. Let's make this game last a while.
I don't even remember this. When I saw this card in the Cracker Pack, I was like, I barely remembered it. I would not be able to. You could tell me the card name. You could even tell me the card type, with the card name, and I still would not be able to guess what this card is. This card had no effect.
Okay, no effect on the game. That's a little sad. Let's see. Next card is
Curiosity.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just
OG.
Curiosity.
The
Okay,
OG.
sweet. Is this the first time Curiosity was printed?
Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about when we come to the cards. The Kraken packs have given us a lot of natural jumping off positions, and one of them is that there's a lot of the original effects of things that we refer to, Curiosity and Shock, these even the Welkin Hawk. There's just a lot in that mind space that these we're still at the point where trends are being set. And yeah, I mean, Mana Leak's in the set too, Merfolk Looter, a lot of the fundamental cards for Magic show up here.
Yeah, so Curiosity is blue for an enchant creature, and if the enchanted creature damages an opponent, you may draw a card. So did this play well? I mean, it feels like if Shadow's around, maybe it's a thing.
It played fine. I would like. Let's say that there, as expected, there are games where it just kind of carried away the game because you put it on a shadow creature. I mean, people did this all the time. There was a few blue shadow creatures they would put it on there and just like basically get draw a card every turn, and in this environment, a card every turn for like 2 turns or 3 turns is basically kind of game over at that point. A couple interesting things to note is that if you put it on your opponent's creature, you draw a card if they attack you. So that's actually something that doesn't work for most modern versions of this card. And the other thing is, this doesn't say combat damage. So if you put it onto a pinger, you'd also draw a card if you were able to do damage, which did happen. There was a couple of pingers in the set, especially in Tempest. Rootwater Hunter being kind of the biggest one, which is essentially a prodigal sorcerer, but a merfolk. And people would just kind of like, that would be their deck. They'd be trying to kind of like assemble Rootwater Hunter and Curiosity and just kind of like, just draw a bunch of cards for free. This card is actually pretty fine. I think it might be the best card so far, but that is without looking at the rare.
So and the rare here.
The rare here is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's called Equilibrium, like in the proud history of balance and cards like that. It is 1 blue for an enchantment, and it says whenever you successfully cast a creature spell, you may pay 1. If you do, you return target creature to its owner's hand.
Yeah,
this.
There's not even any concept of successfully cast a creature spell anymore. This was back when interrupts were like the first window. So you'd like play a creature. If they didn't counter it, then you would you'd get to Equilibrium. But in reality, it's just whenever you play a creature, pay 1 to bounce a creature. Yeah, unbeatable.
And by the way, the templating in today is just whenever you cast a creature spell. Like it does not have to resolve. Yeah.
Yes.
And first of all your creatures are just mana wars, so you're just going to beat them down. You're going to play a creature, you're going to play Equilibrium, you're going to go 4-drop bouncer thing. They're going to play something, you're going to go 3 or 4-drop bouncer thing, and then two more times of that, and they're like super dead. But you could also loop your cheap creatures if you had an ETB on one of them. You could just keep bouncing stuff. Like it is just a completely out of pocket card.
Yeah,
that is absurd.
I mean, if you had this card nowadays, it would still be ridiculous. So again,
that's a good way. That's a good way of putting it. Of these 2 packs that we've seen, how many cards from would you put in a modern limited deck? And the answer is just like 2, maybe, of the 2 packs total. And it's just like, that is just not what cards are made of anymore. Like the cards are just completely different. But Equilibrium is one of those cards.
Well, it's weird because they either miss way too low where it's like, what? Or you get a card like Equilibrium where it's like, what? Like this is busted, right? It's strange how not often they were able to just kind of hit that middle ground, like with the Furnace Brood, the 3 in a red 3/3 or the 3 in a white 2/4, just cards like that. Even the Flowstone guy, right? Like not a good card, but like you could see how that could be part of somebody's limited deck that they put together. A 2/2 that might get a little bigger. Ooh, and or maybe I can bump its toughness and then I can pump it up a bunch or, play out some little thing. But so many of these are just like stone cold misses, right? It's so much space is just completely wasted here.
I mean, look, this is a really good example of the power and the usefulness of the thing that we talked about with the listener question. Mm-hmm. Like, there were no templates for limited back then, and so have a look at now how many creatures are in this pack. Not a lot of them, and so many of the non-creatures are really kind of like don't interact with combat. Don't interact with like a lot of like common scenarios.
There's 5 creatures in a pack of 15 cards, or I guess this is 14 cards, and one's a 3-power creature, one's a 2-power creature, and the other 3 are 1 power. and if you go back and you look at the pack that we did before,
there's 7
Stronghold, and they're all 2/2s and 1/1s.
Yeah,
they're all 1 or 2 power. I guess a couple of them could pump greater than that, but yeah,
I mean, the one that had more creatures still didn't reach the halfway point, you know, and then the other one was way short at only 5.
I mean, this is just in an era where when, you know, we were talking about the skeleton, right, of the set. Back then it was like, what are the random thoughts that the designers had, just kind of not even like, did we use a set skeleton, but did we check that like there were enough creatures to finish games? Like, how many creatures had more than 2 power? You know, famously, this is obviously even a little older, but like Legends has 1 red common creature that can attack. Like, they didn't quite go that far for once they started, you know, actually testing to some degree draft. But you look at some of these old sets, and it is pretty scattershot where things ended up. Like if you look at like a power level, you know, like a graph of where each of the power level of cards landed or whatever, especially like by like mana cost or something. Most sets like these days, it's probably like it goes up as the mana cost goes up, the power goes up, and like there's some outliers, you know, like Shield Dread probably is like a lot more powerful than the average 4 or whatever, but it kind of trends in that direction, and probably somewhat linearly, maybe some jumps as you get to like above 6 or above 8. Back then it was just like you took a paintbrush and you went whoosh, and the dots would be all over the map, because it's like some of the best cards in the set cost 2 or 3 mana just kind of randomly. Some of these cards could compete with modern card design. And then a bunch of them are just like, wow, this costs 4 mana and it's worse than the average 1 drop in like a modern set. It was just like the range was incredibly wide back then of what you would get when you opened a pack or just saw a new set.
Yeah, these designs are closer to modern art than they are to modern set design. I mean, you know, kind of random. You don't really get it, but maybe it's kind of cool.
But it's funny because, you know, that I guess, you know, we can consider it as pack wrapped. We're taking Equilibrium, not the hardest choice in the world. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about how many like building block cards there are in Stronghold / Exodus combined. I mean, I touched on it before with like Curiosity, but there, you know, there's Mana Leak, Merfolk Looter, like Recurring Nightmare, Shock. Like Shock, wow. Classic Shock. This was printed here, and Shock is like kind of a benchmark in a lot of ways for cards. I mean, we still say I shock your thing or a shock land. Like there are millions of Magic players who don't even know what Stronghold is barely, besides maybe, oh, I've heard of that set, who know what shock is and use it to describe other things. Like it is that much of like a fundamental. And, you know, Sphere of Resistance, like the 2 mana artifact that makes all spells cost 1 more, like this card, I think, was the first. I mean, Nethervoid, I guess, was the first, but Sphere was like, it led directly to like Thorn of Amethyst. It probably had something to do with Trinisphere. Like these are fundamental cards. City of Traders is in this set. I guess Ancient Tomb was before it. And, you know, Mox Diamond, like so many of these really pivotal cards that either spawned a lot of follow-up Soul Wardens in the set. 1 mana, 1/1, whatever creature comes to play, you gain a life. There's like 15 of these cards now. Yeah. And some of the like really big like tentpole constructed cards, like I mentioned, you know, Recurring Nightmare, Mox Diamond, Survival of the Fittest, like there were, you know, Dream Halls. Like there's just a lot of really cool cards in these sets, and there's a lot of really bad, either from a power level or design or both perspective, like the Lycids and like, you know, this just completely forgettable cards. Like Dizzying Gaze manages to hit the like, but check the boxes of incredibly bad design, but also really low power level. And like it's bad and not fun, but when it is good, it's also really horrendous for your opponent. Yeah. So it's like, wow, you know, I've talked about Counterbalance being one of the worst designs in Magic. This is the enchantment for blue that whenever your opponent plays a spell, you flip your top card, and if it's got the same cost, their spell's countered. And the old combo was Sensei's Divining Top. You locked your opponent out of playing spells. When Counterbalance is in play, either your opponent's miserable because you're countering every spell, or you're miserable because you don't have top and you're missing on the blind flip counterbalances. And there's a lot of cards back then where it's like, it's impossible for both players to be having a fun game when this card's involved.
Well, man, some of those
very challenging.
Some of those cards you said are really iconic. Like this is Merfolk Looter's first appearance.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, we just use that word.
A card, then discard a card. It's literally called looting.
It's just called looting.
It's called looting so much that it's even in the game where looting means this thing.
Right.
Like, It's crazy.
It's that much, mana leak that you mentioned. I mean, we what is it called? Ether, whatever from the last set, Ether Spike.
Ether Spike, yeah.
Right. You know, if Luis and I are talking, I will just say I had the mana leak, and he knows exactly what I mean, right? Like these are shortcuts that we use to this day, and this was in 1998.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Magic was at a time where they were still exploring the space that they had designed, it's not that many years after. It's like 4 years after kind of Magic got released, and so there's still like quite a lot of trails to be blazed, basically with card design, and I think that's kind of one of the good things about some of these old sets, where they're really just trying to throw things on the wall and see what sticks, and it affects things like average card quality, and affects things limited poorly because you get the packs like what we saw. But really, what it also does is it allows them to kind of like find what does work. Now, a good example of kind of like understanding that is like Shard Phoenix. Shard Phoenix is actually kind of like a bit of a redux of an earlier card called Hammer of Bogarden from Mirage, and it kind of like represented kind of recursion, like in a way that kind of like was unlike any other card except for Hammer, and actually it kind of spawned an entire archetype. Like Counter Phoenix was like so like effective. That
for reference, Shard Phoenix is 4 and a red for a 2/2 flyer. You could sack it to deal 2 damage to each creature without flying, and during your upkeep, you could pay red to return it from your graveyard to your hand.
Yep. And the way that people would actually use it is that they would combo Shard Phoenix. Apart from the Shard Phoenix doing what it does, just like being able to suppress creatures, you would also combine it with a card that is in Exodus called Forbid, where you would actually discard the Shard Phoenix to get the pay for the buyback cost. So Forbid is blue 1. It's a interrupt, which I guess is instant now, and you could buy it back for discarding 2 cards. So you could actually get a player locked by just kind of like
what it does is it counters target spell.
Yeah, sorry, counters target spell. I'm not looking at the card right now.
I understand. Like I'm like that TBS in the sense that I know what every card in Stronghold does pretty much. Like, and certainly all the good ones, I definitely know what they do. I could just recite them by memory, right? But yes, I would say that not all of our listeners were even alive when the card was printed. But
this is true.
I mean, it's a messed up card. To explain how people used it, and they will see.
Yeah. So it says blue 1 counter target spell, and then. But you could buy it back for discarding 2 cards. Now, Shard Phoenix, like as you explained before, you could play red to return it to your hand. So, and there were just enough ways to kind of like get the mana out that you could actually get them into what they call like a forbid lock, where they could just basically play no more spells because you would always have enough cards to pay for the buyback because Shard Phoenix kind of like came back for free. Now, that sounds like a lot of mana in kind of like modern terms, but like the formats back then kind of like allowed for that.
Games were so long.
Yeah, they just took so long, and like land drops were really, really kind of like important in those control decks where you just like need to play land every.
TBS people were just cleaning up back then. Randy Bueller and like the guys who got it immediately by just going like, I'm going to play 28 lands in my constructed deck. My average opponent is playing 20, maybe less, and it's like people just didn't realize. Like I mean we've talked about it before on the show, but the metric I was told 20 lands, 20 spells, 20 creatures.
Yeah,
and it's like. Yeah, well, it would be better to play, 28 lands or 30 lands than it would be to 20 probably, even if 24 was probably a better number for most decks. And these like, kind of like counter Phoenix decks would just be like, yep, I'm going to play 1 million lands and these like buyback cards and cards I can get back from my graveyard and do some 1-for-1 trades and then just completely grind you out. And Forbid is just such a ridiculous card. Like, how many people got completely locked out by someone with Forbid in a way to draw an extra card every turn, whether it be a Shard Phoenix, whether it be an Ophidian hitting you and drawing a card, whatever. And it's like, play pattern was just not the kind of thing they thought about back then. They thought, does this sound cool? Would maybe I have fun playing it without really thinking of like, how is this going to play out? And Forbid is, I don't know what in the bottom 1% of Magic cards in terms of what the play pattern looks like when it's going. Because when it's going, it's like, oh, you're going to counter my 7th spell in a row. Oh, I'm never going to resolve another spell again. Cool.
Yeah,
it's funny that people kind of didn't get driven away by the game. I mean, obviously the game was a bit more core and like, when I say core, I just mean like the people who played it really like, were kind of diehards for Magic. And so they just were able to kind of withstand a lot more negative experiences. At least, I want to say maybe the people are the same, but like for some reason it didn't drive away as much as it felt like. I'm sure it did actually drive people away, but like at the time it didn't feel as oppressive as what we're talking about.
Well, I think that there's a couple things to it. One is that a lot of people didn't play the hyper-optimized constructed that we're talking about, where you were playing against John Finkel with Forbidian. If you were playing that, you were in for the competition, and a bad play pattern is not going to drive you away. And even more so, if you were one of the people who got it, it probably was so fun to play these tournaments where you were just 70% to win the tournament. Like John Finkel, walking into a PTQ with Forbidian, like what percent was he to win that tournament? He's probably 50% to win the tournaments he played in.
Yes.
I got to experience like even like a little taste of this years later when you had a good extended deck and I would play Psychotog at one of these tournaments and it'd be like, yeah, I've got some close matches. I've got some like at the top 8 is really tough. Like I have tough opponents, but in the 7-round PTQ, you'd play against 3 of your 7 opponents where they could never win. They were just playing a deck that had no possibility of success. And winning papers over a lot of this stuff. So even if some of these play patterns weren't the most fun, I don't think that necessarily impacted you because you were playing. Magic's just such an intrinsically fun and awesome game. A lot of the people playing it were just like me back then. I never got Forbid luck because I didn't play in the kind of tournaments where you could do that. I was just playing booster drafts and cards you own tournaments at the local store, and people just weren't doing stuff like that. And we had a ton of fun, even though I understand a lot of these cards aren't the most fun when you kind of play them out.
Luis, if you had to pick what the most iconic card from Exodus was, what would it be? And don't get this wrong, Luis. Don't get this wrong.
I think it's probably Recurring Nightmare.
No, it's not. It's not Recurring Nightmare.
Hold on, let me see. Let me look to see if I can figure it. Like I have one, but
it's 2 words.
I know what you're saying. It's limited resources.
It's limited resources.
There is that. You want to talk about fun cards? Limited resources is not on the list of cards I would consider particularly fun.
We love this card because it's part of the pun of our name of the podcast when we picked it, but it is so awful. It's literally banned in Commander. Like you can't even play it. It's white for an enchantment, and it says when limited resources enters the battlefield, each player chooses 5 lands they control, sacrifices the rest, and players can't play lands as long as 10 or more lands are on the battlefield.
Which in a 2-player game doesn't do that much. In a 4-player game, yeah,
kind
you
of
could
a
probably
lot
do the math
for
on that.
1 mana, by the way.
Let's just say I'm extremely skeptical of any card that has the text "players cannot play lands." Like, what are you doing? Like, what? I can't think of very many justifiable cards. Like, you could maybe make a 10-mana card that does something, crazy, and like the end result is people can't play more lands. But a 1-mana card.
Come on, but you would say though that much like this podcast, this card is broken and overpowered, right?
Yeah, and
so we've got that going for us.
My biggest disappointment, honestly, is that I just don't like the art on limited resources. It is weird. It's just not that interesting. It's just 2 mages doing a thing. There's like a bunch of cleavage on the art. Like I'm not like,
yeah, it's corny.
And the reason I say this is because we got approached a couple of years ago. The owner of the original limited resources art was going to sell it to us. Mm-hmm. And I think we both declined in part because like, I just don't want this hanging on my wall. Like I don't, it doesn't do it for me. If it was cooler art, I would have been totally in, but I just, this isn't an art piece I particularly enjoy. So
I have a physical card where somebody took photos of me and Brian Wong and put our faces over these two characters.
Someone tweeted a photo of the two of us in there, and
yeah,
you know,
I've done that too.
Let's just say your position in that photo was more flattering than mine.
TVS, what's your takeaway from these two sets? What were the things that will echo through time in your mind, or that you think of when you think back to them?
Yeah, look, I think Exodus is actually pretty underrated when it comes to impact. I mean, it actually still has a lot of cards that one are very iconic, but also like still hold up the test of time. I mean, as I said before, or I didn't say before, I said it before the cast. I played Oath of Druids, one of the early tournaments that it was available to be played. And this is a card that, like, one, is still in Vintage Cube and still very, very good. It's very powerful and still can, you know, in theory be like played in Vintage itself. There's a bunch of cards like that's still kind of like really, really kind of like impactful. Like Mind Over Matter, in theory, there are still some decks like that play that card. Obviously, Louis said Recurring Nightmare, Survival of the Fittest. I mean, this card is like extremely busted in like, is it banned in Legacy? I think it might be.
Recurring Nightmare?
No, Survival.
Caleb Durward got Survival banned in Legacy.
Oh, yes.
Because of Survival for Root Wall, Survival for Root Wall, Survival for Vengevine, then Survival for 2 Root Wallas.
Yes.
I don't know. I think Survival could probably pass muster at this point, but Legacy's a toxic wasteland while Grief is legal anyway. It's like 52% scam decks. I played a couple Legacy events lately, and I literally played against scam every single round. Just 7 rounds of that. You know, cool. Great format you got.
I mean, there's a lot of like miserable but like well-known cards, like Sphere of Resistance is another one of those. It's kind of like, yeah, you don't get to play spells, but at the time it felt, it actually wasn't that exciting a card, but now obviously is like a mainstay of the vintage shop deck. And City of Traders. I mean, City of Traders actually at the time people was like kind of laughed at the card. So the City of Traders is a land, and it produces 2 mana, like when you tap it. But if you play another land, it gets sacrificed. And at the time, it's like it felt like it was just not ever worth kind of like sacrificing a land for like a temporary kind of boost. But the test of time is actually this is actually one of the most powerful cards of the set. And honestly, Soul lands or City of Traders lands, it's kind of a benchmark of like what a powerful land can do. I mean, Labyrinth that came from MH3 is a City of Traders, and it's probably worse than City of Traders, like even though it doesn't get sacrificed. So it kind of shows you how powerful City of Traders is.
So is it these iconic cards that are the takeaways for you? Like the fact that there are, for 2 small sets that we covered today, that was a lot of cards that we listed that are very memorable and have had iterations upon them, times 50.
Yeah, I mean, look, back at the time, these sets still felt good. I mean, it's funny that we just look at these sets and say, oh man, there's so many bad cards, but like, I do not remember these not fondly, like opening packs. I mean, I think Exodus is definitely better than.
I think there's a reason for that, though. I think in Constructed, you played with the good cards, and these were like way above average, especially for like hits in Constructed, especially compared to some of the sets surrounding them. And in Limited, you kind of didn't realize all the cards were bad, so none of them were bad. Like you didn't really realize how bad these things were. It would probably be a bit of a system shock going back from Modern Limited to go back to playing that now.
Yeah, and that's my takeaway from these sets too, is that they definitely still hadn't figured out Limited yet. You can see the block structure form, but these sets, just the ratios of creatures, just the most fundamental thing that you would want to start with if you were going to design a set with Limited in mind at all, wasn't there yet, obviously, from what we opened. But they really nailed it on the icons, on the big pictures. They had some really great ideas in these sets that finished off, that
one of the
stood
cool
the test
things
of time.
About being a designer back then, I think that I'm a little envious of is like you get rewarded for your hits, but not really punished for your misses in a way that kind of just lets you take shots.
Yeah.
The sets just aren't dissected the way they are now. Like, the data is not there. Like we're so many worlds different now than we were then that they kind of correctly got praised for like Sliver Queen and like these awesome cards. And the fact that, there was a lot of really unfun cards or weak cards, like kind of didn't matter that much. Like again, cooler. It's cooler to miss high than it is to miss low. And I would rather they did that back then. And I think they kind of got rewarded for it.
And to kind of like round it back to limited, obviously, because, that's what this podcast is about, is like limited kind of was self-correcting in a way that meant that like just playing limited was fun even back then, even with bad cards. Like, yes, the paradigm is different. Like you're trying to struggle to your 23rd card rather than cut down to your 23rd card. But also everybody was playing on a relatively even playing field. And limited is still fun, even if it's a little bit more grindy and it's a little bit more kind of like about resource management rather than kind of like, let's call it sequencing. I think nowadays it's much more about sequencing and mana usage. That back then it was much more about card advantage and kind of like avoiding playing the terrible cards. And I think like it sounds like it's like more miserable, but actually that puzzle, when there was not that many people kind of like understanding kind of what that puzzle was actually a great kind of feeling. And honestly, I would still play these formats. Maybe it would feel weird and maybe it would take a while to get used to it. It'd still be fun because you're just kind of figuring what is the leverage points in these formats, in these kind of card sets that allow you to actually kind of like work with the resources you're given. And so it's still good in hindsight, but just different. And
see, for me, this is too far down that line. Like I want to get to the point where they realize that you should at least have a bunch of creatures in the set. If they're low powered and we all have low powered creatures, I'm fine with that. I can find the little edges, but like when you're just scrapping it out to try to get enough just things that have power, like that is, I'm ready to leave that behind. Like if you were like, hey, do you want to go do this Stronghold whatever draft? I'd be like, nah. But if you fast forward like a couple of years, I'd probably be in. I actually prefer lower powered, but.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not as bad as like alpha when it comes to like not having enough creatures. There's actually, when you play it out, when you draft it out, like it's not, it's very rare.
Features TBS, I have to go summon mine, so I'll leave you guys to it. Stronghold and Exodus were a lot of fun. I have fun.
Yes.
Okay, Luis. Yes. Thanks, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just saying, like, I don't think it was as kind of like a creature desert as we've implied and as the Cracker Packs have.
Oh, okay. So maybe it's not quite that bad.
It's not quite that bad. But that being said, yes, you have to be really, really aware of your creature count, like back then, which you don't really have to be now because you kind of stumble into the right amount of creatures. And even the curves, I think mana curve is actually even more important because they didn't have that template. So therefore, the amount of creatures at each kind of like point of the mana curve was like off. So you actually have to kind of like remember. Whereas nowadays, they kind of build the set such that as long as you kind of like not being too stupid about it, you'll actually get a mana curve that's quite decent because the distribution at common and uncommon is high enough that you actually can, you'll have like a few 5-drops and you have like more, like, you'll often have like 5 or 6 2-drops just naturally because of the density of certain things. And I think that's actually the kind of the benefit. Like you just kind of can be a bit more autopilot when it comes to like things like how much mana should I put in my deck or how does my curve work? It's just more natural that you aren't falling into traps. And there's plenty of traps in kind of these old sets. I mean, overall, look, I think the modern kind of draft is better, but I don't think it was like not fun back then. And that's kind of the point I was trying to make.
One question I have about that, do you think that the machine that we put these sets through in these days, right, with it being primarily online where most drafts happen and the speed and data that we get, via things like 17 Lands, social media, podcasts, where kind of everybody's on the same page within honestly a couple of days to get the first snapshot and then call it a week to kind of the format usually settles after about a week or maybe 10 days of drafting. And then it's kind of like you might start, trying out a few things here or there, but it's rare that a format like dramatically changes after that point. Do you think this would hold up under that lens?
No, but I actually don't think the current situation is as dire as you're saying either. I'm not saying, maybe you're not implying that. Because obviously the last few sets have had, like, let's call it clear standout color pairs or colors. And part of that is the proliferation of data, via 17 lands in general. But what is quite funny, at least for me, one, I personally enjoy the challenge of trying to figure out kind of like what is the counter to the popular like strategies. And, from Luis's explanation last week, when he was talking about the PT testing, like they found kind of lanes that people were not kind of like in as much as they should be. And I think what the current 17 lands or data like plentiful orthodoxy does is it allows for people to level, like people who care, to level the people who are like kind of using the basic amount of information.
For sure.
Right. So again, yes, I think if you played kind of the average, like, non-pod draft and you're just playing kind of on a ladder, yes, there's kind of like the best strategy when you default. But I think when you play on the PT level, or even kind of, let's call it, like the RCQ top 8 level, you can actually exploit some of the kind of laziness people are having.
For sure.
And I think, and I think that is kind of true for this. I think you'd have an orthodoxy of like what people believe or what is the best color combination, but then you'd have the leveling happen. And I think that would happen with pretty much any set now. Now, I think some sets are worse because, like, maybe the power level of the best color is too high. But I think it's pretty rare actually that it's not kind of like exploitable by someone who's canny or who's like looking for a way to exploit it. So yeah. So I actually think in general, draft does self-correct. Some sets we don't have enough, and maybe the orthodoxy kind of like settles too early. So we're saying, hey, after a week, we all know what the best color is and the best common, and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe we lose some of that kind of like early exploration. But actually, I think kind of the later format kind of cycles where you're trying to like be the next, trying to be in the ahead of the last trend, I think would still happen. And I think that's actually, hopefully, will still remain.
Yeah, because I definitely didn't mean that it was a negative. I just meant that like whatever is in this set, we know it. Not everything about it. Like you said, I agree with everything you said about the leveling game, and that's what we focus on a lot here in the immediate weeks after a set comes out, for sure. I wonder, and the kind of the crux of my question was, that method, 17 lands, information traveling very quickly, people doing tons and tons of drafts in a short period of time, it tends to expose flaws in a set.
Yes.
Right. So if a set is bad or has a major flaw where like one color's unplayable or one common's absurdly good or one strategy is just way out in front, that is addressable within the context of the draft, as you said. But we will know it, right? Or we'll know, hey, this is actually pretty balanced. Like, you can do a bunch of different stuff here. There's nothing that's really like leapt out as week one. If you hammer it, you're just going to win a ton of drafts, because nobody really knows quite yet type thing. And I am curious if we did like a Tempest, Stronghold, Exodus draft, on Arena or whatever, and let it go for a few weeks and something, if it would be like, wow, like we've put the modern, magnifying glass to this and it's ugly, right? Like we're just going like, oh God, this is horrible. There's so many wrong things. Or it could be like how a normal set is, where there's going to be some things that are good, some things that are bad, and it's really just about how we react to them or how we adjust to them.
Yeah, I think it's actually more the former. I mean, I think the poorer draft sets definitely will be worse, because the number of unplayables is so high. And so if kind of like everybody's like kind of crowding towards the best cards, and
also the number of cards, I wonder how that would matter. Probably an aside, but the total number of cards available is much smaller.
Right. And which is why I think it would end up being less fun because like
less repeatable.
Let's say because let's say I'm just saying like 50% of the cards are like playable in limited decks, and whereas a modern set would have, let's call it closer to 70 or 80% kind of like playable in modern limited decks. I think if that was exposed, as in everyone knew what those top 50 were, it doesn't allow you a lot of room to maneuver because the other 50 are just unplayable. Like they just don't fit into any kind of strategy, or they're too weak or everything. So you're actually competing for a kind of like a small pool, and it's not like you can just go to kind of like, the next tier. The next tier is just unplayable.
Right.
So
it would be interesting to see that on 17 lands where like right now, if it's like a really good common, it's up in the higher 50%, 58, 59% win rate for some of the better commons in the set, unless it's a broken one. But for the most part, that's where they land, but the scale is usually fairly gradient from 58 down to 48 or whatever it is at the bottom. But, you would probably see a 60, a 58, a 59, and then a 40, or ones that like don't have enough sample size to really rate because people just completely ignore them. It'd be really interesting. All right. Well,
I mean, just one thing. I think it came at a time where like the bad sets, and I say the bad limited sets, came at a time where there's low information. And I think that does meet like it worked well because like people played bad cards. We talked about like, the ones you had to sack lands and stuff like that. Like people would play them. They would not play them now. And I think that's kind of why contextually it felt like a better limited set because the knowledge was lower, and so therefore the draftable cards was wider, at least on a perception level to a lot of players. Yeah. And I think so nowadays they have to widen that funnel because people know how to play limited more. There's more data out there, et cetera, et cetera. You can get more reps.
Be really interesting to see that. Yeah. Again, for me, the big takeaways from these sets are the big shots that they took and the ones that they landed. It's just wild, the ripple effect that these type of cards that just seem like, like Merfolk Looter, I think is a perfect example. It has not only spawned a ton of different variants of cards that loot to this day in sets that came out this year, right? That can trace their lineage right back to Merfolk Looter, but also the vernacular. I mean, like Louis said, we just call it looting. I don't think that they've adopted it as the official, like, how it literally says mill a card now, like on a Magic card. And if people don't know, that's from Millstone, which is the same type of thing that I'm talking about. It's the first card that did that type of thing, taking cards from library and putting them in the graveyard. And looter, everybody just calls it looting. I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up on cards where it said at the beginning of your upkeep, loot, if you, and then you would just know rummage, these type of things. But I mean, that's just one example from these sets that aren't that many cards. I mean, combined, these two small sets are still smaller than a regular big set these days, right? Yeah. It's both of the sets together. It's not that many shots that they had to take. And there's some serious icons in here, again, that really did, echo through the game and are still around, 25 years later.
Yeah, it's kind of because they had a less stringent kind of testing regime. So therefore, you get kind of like higher variance. Your trash cards are more trash, but also your hits are just like kind of on a power level and kind of like on a weirdness level in some ways, like much, much more outliers. And so that's, I think, why you have a lot of these old sets having like a bunch of just cards that are like just like complete power outliers because they just didn't have as many heuristics about the design, and so therefore your results are wider. And so I think that's that's better at the earlier stages of a game where you're trying to kind of like excite people and kind of show you the width and breadth of the game that you're playing. So
yeah,
I think while they don't like live up to kind of modern scrutiny on a kind of a card by card basis. I think from a impact in the game, this is exactly what you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Great sets. And great stuff, TBS. Thanks so much for taking the time to hang out with us. Where can people find you if they want to catch up? You're over in Jolly Old now. Like, what do you?
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm in London. Obviously, the best place to get me is same as always on X or Twitter.
Mm-hmm. I'll put a link in the show notes for yours there.
Yep. I am currently working on a little content piece that I want to see if I can get rolling. I know I always say, hey, I've got something going on.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the slowness is the fact that I have two very young kids, but also I have, pretty demanding jobs. So like I'm kind of slowly kind of like doing some video editing and kind of like, so I plan to do some YouTube content in the near future.
Cool. Is it Magic related?
It is Magic related.
Oh, I'm interested.
And those who kind of like have enjoyed some of the stuff we're talking about here will find it kind of like down their alley. So it's going to be a little more backward looking, a little more kind of like, hey, don't you remember when?
Mm-hmm. Nostalgia stuff. That's great.
Yeah,
we'll look forward to it. Stuff. Well, let us know when it launches, and we'll have you back on to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I've got to be on more so I need to take the Limmy away from Sirkovitz as well, because he will not get away.
Yeah. All right. The battle continues between you. And by the way, you guys are on the same island, right? So like, there could be a land war somehow forming.
I mean, Cornwall was pretty far, but I think I might be going down there soon because it's actually kind of a nice like summer like vacation area. So
you might swing by his house and throw a rock through his window with a nasty note on it.
Well, look,
the Limmy's mine this year. Back off.
Look, honestly, it's funny because like I've never met him in real life, but I've came on his podcast as well. Mm-hmm. But now we actually kind of like have a very friendly kind of rapport on Twitter.
Oh, he's great.
Messages and forth. He's fantastic.
He's so awesome. I've never met him in real life either, but I will at some point, and I look forward to it. Yeah, he's great. But maybe you're better. We'll find out at the end of the year for the Limmys. That'll do it for this episode of the show. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR. Luis is LSV and TBS is TBS-. Again, I'll have a link to that in the show notes, as well as that Mark Rosewater article that I mentioned before if you want to check that out. We want to thank our sponsor, Ultimate Guard. Make sure you check them out for all your card protection needs, as well as our Patreon, patreon.com/limited resources. lrcast.com is where you can find every episode of the show, as well as links to all of our stuff. Thank you so much for hanging out, and we'll see you next time. Hey, for a sign-off, TBS, I don't know if you have something in mind, but do you?
I do.
Yeah, go for it.
I do.
Go for it.
I mean, it's, for those who follow me on Twitter, they actually heard the story, but I also wanted to kind of contribute to, let's call it the living legend that is Kai.
Good.
And,
that's what I was going to ask you about. That's great. Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, so one of my most endearing memories of Kai is very much connected to, what was actually one of the, my greatest accomplishments as a Magic player. So, I knew Kai from online, like as I was talking about, like on the IRC playing like NetDraft and stuff like that. But one of the first times that I actually really, really got to know him was when the Magic Invitational, which used to be kind of like they used to invite some of the most memorable pro players and contributors to a tournament kind of designed by Mike Rosewater. Anyway, that tournament came to Sydney in 2000, and I was able to kind of like, mingle with some of my, while I was friends with some of them, they still were very much living legends in my so the Finkles, the Kais, the Ben Rubens, like, all these kind of like really, really memorable players. And because it was in Sydney, and one of the formats was a vintage style format, like it required power and everything, and not everyone had the cards available. And because I was kind of local and kind of in touch with the scene, I was able to kind of like lend cards out of my collection, as well as like acquire cards from some of my friends' collections to help them like make this vintage deck. Anyway, kind of like, so Kai was one of the players that I helped out there.
Uh-huh.
And then flash forward a year later, and they're about to have the same event. And Kai was invited again, but in Cape Town. And so Kai kind of asked me online, says, "Hey, Ben, like, can you lend me cards for this year as well?" And I was like, "You realize that I live in Sydney and it's in Cape Town, right? This is not. I can't just like lend you cards. Like, I don't even know how. Like, sending cards via mail was not really done back then.
Yeah.
What do you expect me to do here?" And it's just like, well, what if I fly you over to Cape Town and you can lend me cards? And I was like, I thought it was joking. And he said, no, I'm serious. I'll fly you over. There happens to be a Grand Prix at the same time. So you can play in the Grand Prix. You can hang out and you can just like let me vintage cards. And this is when, Kai's kind of, I would say the peak of his performance, but like he's been doing well. So I was like, sure, man.
Wow.
Like, this would be great. And you could like crash on my floor to.
I mean, what an offer! That's like so generous.
I mean, yeah, and look, I would say Kai was I would say kind of I was a friend at the point, but like it wasn't that we were super close. So this is like a very, very kind of like way beyond what you would normally expect for any sort of that kind of friendship. Anyway, so he flies me over. You've heard other stories of I won that Grand Prix, which is like kind of incredible.
Awesome.
But also Kai won the Invitational. And so I have, and that was my first Grand Prix win. And I was crashing on Kai's floor. So we actually just swept the weekend in that hotel room. And, I owe to him, through his generosity and just like, friendship, basically, one of the most important kind of like magic moments of my life. But like I want to say this is not an isolated incident. Actually, when I kind of like recounted that story online, I had a bunch of people kind of message me or talk about like, yeah, this is just how Kai is. And I really wanted to highlight that he's a super generous person. I mean, I'm shattered. Like I did know a little bit before this previous weekend because we're friends and about this. And I mean, he is honestly one of the most kind of like kind and really just very just good people in the community. And the fact that he's the GOAT and this, when it could easily, like we see in so many kind of like walks of life and so many situations, that the GOAT can be a little bit of an ass sometimes because, they in some ways it's almost expected that kind of goes hand in hand. And no, he is the most humble and he's just the most like, he likes to help people. He kind of like gives you feedback. I mean, he does it in his own kind of gruff German way.
He's still German, but yeah.
but I just wanted to kind of like, be just recount that story to even more people because
that's awesome.
I mean, I was like lucky enough to be in Amsterdam weekend. We hung out, we had some quality time, and I hope he pulls through because it's not over till it's over. It is very serious and it doesn't look great. But the one thing he said he's going to do is like, I'm just going to keep playing until they tell me to stop playing, or I can't play anymore. And so if you have an opportunity to go to some event that he's going to be at, I mean, like, look, he probably won't appreciate this, like, but you should really just give him kind of like a handshake and thank him for the contributions he's done to the game because he is a true ambassador, and the Magic is a better game for him.